We often think about national threats like armies, like borders being crossed, but what if the real fight is over something more fundamental, something like water?
Hmm.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show where we unpack complex issues using the sources you send us. And today, our source is, well, it's a bit different. It's a fictional thriller called Silent Siege: The Fall of Texas.
Right, and his build is being inspired by true events. It drops us right into that scenario you mentioned, Texas, right at the center of this silent resource conflict.
Exactly. So this deep dive isn't about, dry policy papers or academic studies today.
No, not in the usual sense. We're using this novel, this story, as a kind of lens, really, to look at some potentially very real vulnerabilities.
So the story paints this picture, right? A calculated plan to weaken the U.S. and the target, Texas's water supply, exploiting other things too, disguised as progress.
Yeah, so our mission today really is to dissect these fictional threats, these strategies laid out in the book, and see what insights they might offer, about the world we actually live in.
Okay, let's dive straight in then. Part one of Silent Siege is called The Foreign Plot, and the first chapter is just titled Silent Siege.
Hmm.
The book kicks off with this antagonist, this strategy that completely bypasses traditional war. It's all about economic destruction. And the weapon, it's water. Texas is water.
It's fascinating how the novel outlines this multi-pronged approach. It describes a very deliberate push, getting water-hungry industries into Texas.
Okay.
And at the same time, fast-tracking construction, big projects, right? And conveniently sidestepping the environmental impact studies.
The very studies that might have shown the strain on the water supply.
Exactly, the strain that was already there. And then there's the exploitation of Texas's right of capture water laws.
Which basically means if you own the land, you can pump pretty much all the groundwater you want.
Generally speaking, yes. So the novel suggests the end game here is simple. Drain the aquifers, create a crisis by design.
Yeah. Wow. That's chillingly plausible, isn't it? This whole silent siege idea. Not with bombs and tanks, but with economic moves and twisting existing laws.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about how vulnerabilities can just sit there, hidden in plain sight, inside normal economic stuff.
Absolutely. Which leads nicely into the next bit of the foreign plot in the book. The Trojan chips.
Ah, yes, the GPS Act comes into play here. Now, that's a real thing, obviously. A big push to boost American semiconductor manufacturing. Sounds good, right? National security jobs?
Yeah, on the surface, it's all positive. Bring chip making back home. But the novel, it calls this out. It says there's a lethal flaw.
And that flaw, according to the book, is that the rush, the urgency to get these plants built meant overlooking or maybe bypassing those critical ecological studies again.
The ones that would have flagged how water-stressed Texas already was and how much water these chip plants actually need.
Precisely. The novel even throws in some real-world names like Samsung in Taylor, Texas, TSMC out in Arizona, and it introduces this character, Eloy Minsk, sort of a visionary tech figure with these huge plans.
Okay.
And the narrative kind of implies that, American pride, wanting to be number one in tech, again, the lure of economic growth, maybe all that blinded people to the environmental costs, especially the water costs in a place like Texas.
It definitely raises that question, doesn't it? In our big rush for progress, do we sometimes just miss the fundamentals? Do we actually have the resources for this?
It's a powerful point in the narrative. Makes you think about those trade-offs, the ones we make, often without really saying it, between the quick economic win and, well, long-term survival, resource-wise.
So that brings us to part two of the novel, The State Sellout, and it starts with a chapter called The Space Tourism Gambit. This bit looks back at the 2012 Space Tourism Act in Texas.
Right, the push to make Texas a big player in commercial spaceflight.
And the novel highlights Eloy Minsk again, his company SpaceX, getting that launch site near South Padre Island, which, as the book points out, is in a sensitive wildlife area. There were protests, apparently.
Yeah, the book frames this whole space tourism thing as maybe a bit of a distraction. Glamorous, exciting, sure, but potentially a cover for what it calls more sinister aims.
Sinister aims like?
Well, the novel hints at things like getting a monopoly over Earth orbit, controlling global communications, but maybe more relevant for our deep dive today.
Yeah.
It connects this space stuff directly to getting a license to drain Texas dry without oversight.
How so?
The implication is these huge space operations need significant resources, and all the excitement about rockets and space travel might just divert everyone's attention, public attention, regulators, from those demands. especially water.
Ah, okay. So the focus on the shiny new thing lets the older, maybe more critical resource issues slide.
That seems to be the suggestion. It really brings up that idea of unintended consequences, doesn't it? You encourage innovation here, but maybe you accidentally open the door for exploitation somewhere else if you're not looking at the whole picture.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, the second part of the state sellout is the Californian exodus. This covers that real trend of tech companies moving from, say, Silicon Valley to Texas.
We've all heard the reasons, right? Lower taxes, less regulation, cheaper land.
Sure, the standard pitch. But the novel, again, suggests something more worrying underneath.
Which is?
The water. The massive amount of water these tech industries actually use. The book suggests their combined thirst could push Texas way past its sustainable water limits.
And interestingly, the narrative points out that California's leaders weren't exactly protesting this move. Maybe even, quietly happy about it.
So the picture it paints is Texas being so eager for the jobs and the investment, basically letting itself be set up for exploitation by attracting industries it couldn't really support water-wise.
That's the implication. It's subtle, but it's powerful. The very things that make you attractive can also be your downfall if you don't keep an eye on those fundamental resource limits.
Okay, so Part 3 shifts focus. It goes local to a place called Bryan, Texas. The section is Bryan's Secret, and Chapter 1 is Stone 1, The Call to Battle.
Right, and this introduces a key character, Bob Ackgill. That's Achgill, and it's pronounced Ackgill.
Good to know. Bob Ackgill. So he decides to run for Bryan City Council back in August 2024.
Yeah, and the novel, it doesn't explicitly say why right away, not totally linking it to the water stuff yet, but it strongly hints at it. It says he saw too many warning signs.
Okay, and his motivation gets clearer with his 5 stones. What are those?
They represent his core principles. Let's see, preserving freedom in the Constitution, water security for future generations, safeguarding our economic future, defending borders and sovereignty in space, the new frontier, ensuring fair use for Texas.
And the novel specifically flags Stone 2, water security.
It does. It says that one would become the center of a historic battle for Bob Ackgill. Really brings these big, abstract threats down to a very local, personal level.
It does indeed. Okay, the next chapter in this part is Secrets in the Water. This sounds ominous.
It is. This is where the novel reveals that back in May 2024, Bryan city leaders got some absolutely devastating news.
What was it?
Their water security forecast. It plummeted. Went from a comfortable 50 years down to just 8 to 10 years.
8 to 10 years, that's a crisis.
A looming one, yeah. But what's really troubling in this story is the decision these leaders make. They decide to keep it secret.
Keep it secret? Why?
Until after the elections, the book says. Meanwhile, you've got S&P Global, the big credit rating agency, giving Bryan this great AA+ bond rating. Seems totally at odds with an impending water catastrophe, right?
Completely. How does the novel explain that?
Well, it describes Bob Ackgill actually contacting S&P.
Yeah.
And supposedly in a private chat, a rep admits they knew about the crisis.
They
knew about it, yeah. But they were kind of waiting to see if lawsuits happened, maybe reversing some water rights sales. Publicly, though, silence. The rating didn't reflect the risk.
Wow. That really highlights that theme of information control, doesn't it? Who knows what and who's left in the dark? Investors, citizens.
Exactly. Potentially walking towards a disaster without knowing it.
Okay, part 4 takes the darker turn. The Voice from the Grave. And it focuses again on Stone 2, the water barons.
This chapter tells a specific story. A rancher. He gets this huge offer, $450,000 for his water rights.
Life-changing money for many people.
Absolutely. And the novel shows his struggle, right? The money versus, well, his loyalty to the land, to the future of the community. He even talks it over with a local shopkeeper he trusts.
Oh, okay. And
then shortly after, the rancher dies, mysteriously. The book adds this layer of, suspicion and maybe foul play.
Oh, wow.
And it gets deeper. Later, a Texas ranger finds this hidden letter the rancher wrote.
What did it say?
He expressed his fears, feeling like he was betraying the future. And he revealed something critical. His land held access to about 10% of the area's really crucial aquifer.
10%? That's significant.
Very. And now, with him gone, that control belongs to these unnamed water barons.
So it introduces this element of potential coercion, maybe worse, in consolidating control over water.
That's the heavy implication.
Yeah.
It really raises questions about the ethics of how these large-scale water rights deals might happen and who really benefits.
Yeah, it paints a grim picture how individual choices, maybe made under pressure, can have these huge ripple effects, and how control over something essential like water can shift, maybe not always openly.
Okay, part 5 is the great unraveling.
Yeah.
But it actually starts with a potential solution in the chapter A Race Against Time.
A solution from Bob Ockill.
Yeah. He proposes some really ambitious ideas to tackle that looming water crisis in Bryan.
Like what?
Like a massive pipeline, 21 feet wide, the book says, stretching all the way from the Gulf of Mexico up to Dallas.
Ooh.
And desalination plants, too, using Israeli tech, which is known for being efficient.
Okay, that sounds like a serious infrastructure project. The benefits...
The novel suggests it could provide reliable, clean water for Central Texas, and maybe at a pretty low cost. But there's a catch.
The timeline.
Exactly. The estimate to build all this, 8 to 10 years.
Which is exactly how long they supposedly have left for their aquifers.
Precisely. So the book frames it as this desperate race against the clock.
It really underscores the urgency, doesn't it, for these kinds of slow-motion crises. The fix might be there, but the window to actually do it can be terrifyingly short. Needs foresight, needs action now.
Absolutely. Then the second chapter in part 5 is Stone 3, Defending the Economy. This pulls back to the bigger picture again.
Right, the economic fallout. The novel really stresses how important Central Texas is to the state's economy. Generates, what, half of Texas's GDP?
That's what the book claims. And it lays out this stark possibility of a cascading economic collapse, not just hitting Texas, but potentially impacting the whole country if the water runs out there.
Yeah, the novel keeps mentioning that Texas leaders are still putting out these really optimistic public statements.
Yeah, that contrast is drawn sharply. It creates this sense of unease, this gap between the official story and the potential underlying disaster.
That disconnect is pretty unsettling. Makes you wonder, what factors lead to that? Is it denial? Is it politics? Something else?
The novel leaves you pondering that. Now, part 6 gets into the space monopoly and the final stone, first chapter. Stone 4, the communications chokehold. This brings us back to Eloy Minsk.
And his satellites.
His many satellites.
Yeah.
By 2024, the novel claims he's launched 7,000 of them.
7,000?
Yeah. Basically giving him, the book suggests, control over the world's internet. And then it poses this question. Around the same time, undersea communication cables start getting severed.
Coincidence.
Or, the book implies, maybe it's a way to make the world even more dependent on his satellite network. It leaves it hanging there.
The bigger concern being
the sheer power. Concentrating control of global communication, information flow, maybe even free speech in the hands of one entity. It's fiction, but it definitely makes you think about real-world trends in tech consolidation.
It does. Okay, the final chapter in this section is Stone 5, Space, the New Gold Rush. Bob Ockill again.
Yes. He puts forward this idea, a Texas Spaceport Trust.
What's the concept?
Basically, the profits from all these space launches happening in Texas should benefit the people of Texas, not just flow to a few companies or individuals.
Like a public trust fund, sort of?
Kind of. And Ockill, in the novel, draws this direct line between unchecked space monopolies potentially dominating orbit and the water barons draining the aquifers.
Saying they're both threats to the public good, exploiting resources without fair return.
Exactly. He's arguing against repeating the same mistakes in this new frontier space that were made with resources on the ground. The book notes, not many people listened at first, but the idea was out there, seeds planted.
Interesting. A call for equity, really, in these big new industries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, part 7, the David race. Sounds like the election.
It is. The chapter is the election and beyond, focusing on Bob Ockill's run for city council. And his campaign was different.
How so?
No big ad buys, no traditional stuff. He just went door to door, talked to voters directly, shared his concerns.
And the result? In the May 2025 election.
He got 20% of the vote, which the book notes was nearly 1,000 votes. Didn't win, but pretty significant for that kind of campaign.
And his take on it?
The novel quotes him saying something like, "I didn't run to win an office, I ran to give a warning." He felt his job was to raise the alarm, tell the truth, win or lose.
If God is in this, signs won't save us. Only truth will. That's quite a statement.
It is. And the book ends that part saying he'd cast his stones. That David and Goliath image again.
It really highlights that idea of individual action, doesn't it? Speaking truth to power, even if the odds seem stacked against you. And 20% suggests the message did get through to quite a few people.
Definitely shows the potential impact one committed person can have.
So how does the novel wrap up? There's an epilogue, silent victory. Victory sounds good, but silent.
Well, the epilogue first paints this really stark picture. The physical consequences are hitting. Dry fields, rivers running low, the sky's quiet, a sense of quiet desperation.
But victory.
The victory, perhaps, is that the novel says people were finally waking up. They were starting to see the reality of the situation.
Okay. An awakening.
And we see Bob Akil again looking at his journal, an entry from April 2025. It references a passage from the book of Joel in the Bible about calling people together during a time of scarcity, famine, lack of water.
And there's notes in the margin.
Yeah, its own writing. Things like, you really know how to get our attention. Just cut off food and water. And then, kind of reflective, thank you that you leave the option open to cry out to you.
Heavy stuff.
It is. And the epilogue closes with him whispering, 5 stones against the giants. The fight isn't over. It's just beginning.
And that final line, remember the Alamo, but also remember Bryan. Wow. Puts the local struggle on par with state legend.
It really elevates the significance of these seemingly small local battles over resources.
So wrapping up our deep dive into Silent Siege, we've basically unpacked this fictional narrative of a multi-layered threat, right? Exploiting water, using tech advances, manipulating economic incentives.
And the novel suggests it involves both, potential external actors and internal forces, maybe failures of oversight or short-sightedness within the state itself, a complex web.
And we have to keep saying, this is fiction. But it's clearly tapping into some very real anxieties people have about water scarcity, about tech's impact, about whether we're really safeguarding our critical resources.
Absolutely. It uses that fictional frame to explore things that feel relevant, things that are being discussed in the real world.
Which leaves us and you with a final thought to maybe chew on. Consider the silent sieges that might be happening right now. Not necessarily like in the book, but maybe subtle pressures on critical resources around us. How aware are we? And what are the modern day stones, those core principles, those individual actions that we need to face these complex challenges? What stones can you identify today?
That's a good question to end on. Something to think about.
Definitely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.